Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by a guest co-host this week because Richard Ebeling, my regular co-host, is in Guatemala delivering some lectures on Austrian economics at Francisco Marroquin University. But it's a pleasure to have back on the show Jefferson Morley. Great author, has written some fantastic books, including an ebook by FFF called CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. He's getting ready to publish a fantastic book on a biography of James Jesus Angleton, the CIA official back in the 1960s. And he's the host of what I consider the best website on the JFK assassination and matters relating to the national security state in that context, and that's jfkfacts.org. Jeff, great to have you back.
Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Yeah, I wanted to have you come on the show to talk about two things. One is this upcoming October scheduled release of the long secret records of the CIA and the FBI and other federal agencies relating to the JFK assassination.
Yes.
That's in the news. You just published a fantastic article along with Rex Bradford in Newsweek magazine, really bringing to the mainstream of American life the importance of this issue and how it works and the things that can go wrong with it still. Mm-hmm. And then the second topic I thought we'd cover is a fascinating subject that I first really discovered you regarding, and that was the matter of the CIA agent named George Joannides. So why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about this deadline, what it involves, how it's going to work, and what's going on with it, and sort of.
Yeah. So I have this big piece in Newsweek this week explaining what I think is generally regarded as a coming news story. And the story is this, that there is in law a statutory deadline where the U.S. government is obliged to make public all of its records related to the assassination of President Kennedy. Why do they have to do this? Because Congress passed a law 25 years ago in 1992 after Oliver Stone's very controversial movie. And Congress said, we don't have anything to hide. We're going to make public all government records on the subject. And so over the years, that has been done by and large. But the agencies, CIA, FBI, IRS, Justice Department, Pentagon, had the right to ask for postponement of the release of the documents for whatever reason. National security, personal privacy, but they could only postpone for up to 25 years. So now the 25 years from 1992, fast forward 25 years, we're in 2017, the government has to make everything public as of the 25th anniversary of that law, which is October 26th, 2017. So what I reported in Newsweek, and which was not known until now, was just how big a collection of records these are. We did know, according to National Archives records, that there were about 3,500 to 3,600 different documents. But a document can have 100 pages in it. So one question was, how much material is this? Not just how many documents is it? And through some very clever forensic reporting on the metadata in a National Archives database, we were able to determine we don't have the contents of these records yet. They're not going to be made public till October, but we know something about them. And so there's actually a great array of information in there. And I run into a lot of people who said, oh, well, the government would have destroyed whatever was interesting a long time ago. That's actually not really true. Intelligence agencies save information because that's their job. So what I reported in Newsweek is there's really a lot of interesting information. For example, the CIA files of 4 different Watergate burglars. The Watergate burglary that brought down President Nixon has always been the object of speculation. And there were always questions about what was the CIA's role in the burglary and the cover-up. Well, these records are going to tell us something about that. So these records are not just assassination related. They're really about America in the Cold War in the 60s and 70s. So we're going to find out if the records are made public, we're going to find out a lot about many different things, as well as about the JFK assassination.
Yeah, well, like Howard Hunt, who was part of the Watergate scandal, I mean, he later pops up with respect to the JFK matter and kind of alludes that he had some inside information that this was a big event, as he called it, within the intelligence establishment.
So, so Howard Hunt, that's one of the most interesting stories that's in there, because he did make these kind of murky statements at the end of his life. Some people called it a deathbed confession, but he wasn't on his deathbed and he didn't confess anything. So I don't think that label is really accurate, but he was trying to say something. And Hunt was not a guy who, he was not one to cast false aspersions on the CIA. He was a very conservative man, very patriotic. So for him to talk this way, I think was revealing. I don't know about the particulars of what he said, because after all, he was a convicted burglar. He was a bit of a scoundrel. He's not the greatest, doesn't have the most credibility. But we've got a couple hundred pages of his CIA file that's going to be made public. Well, that's going to tell us something about who he was and what he did. So maybe you won't get light on JFK, but we're going to learn something.
Yeah, it's nobody has any pretensions that there's going to be this confession that Oliver Stone got it right in his movie JFK, that this was a national security state regime change operation. But what happens inevitably in these types of things is that you get circumstantial evidence that's very tantalizing. And other important things, like if you look at the records that were released as a result of the JFK Records Act, which, as you pointed out, was a direct result of Oliver Stone's movie JFK, you find all kinds of interesting things that they were keeping secret, like Operation Northwoods. That was the secret plan of the Pentagon that they were submitting to Kennedy, saying, let's have terrorist attacks on American soil carried out by U.S. agents and say that they're Cuban communists, and this will provide the pretext for an invasion of Cuba. Well, none of that would have come out if it hadn't been for the JFK Records Act.
Right. No, exactly. And that's a very interesting story. The Operation Northwoods material didn't come out till 1997. It was nothing that Oliver Stone knew about. And if Oliver Stone had put in his movie that the U.S. government was planning, terrorist attacks in the United States to blame it on Cuba, people would have said, oh, he's a crazy conspiracy theorist. But in fact, these were developed by the J5, the planning staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Joint Chiefs approved it. They approved it twice. They approved it in 1962 and in 1963. So to your point, yes, the CIA calls it the mosaic effect, which is when they're trying to keep information secret, they have argued that it's not just the individual piece of information that they want to keep secret, but they want to prevent people from being able to assemble a mosaic of information. And so this little piece of data and that little piece of data don't mean anything until you put them together, and then they start to fill out a picture. So what these JFK records are going to do, if they are released, is they are going to fill out the mosaic that we have of the JFK story. And like you say, any one piece of it may not be that important. But what they tell us about the big picture of what was going on in 1963 could be very important.
Yeah, I like your analogy of the mosaic. I mean, I've often thought of it as like a giant jigsaw puzzle that people put together in their homes, and you can put enough pieces together where you have sort of the big picture. You now know what it's going to say, even if you haven't seen the cover of the jigsaw puzzle, that you still don't have all the pieces, but you're pretty certain on how the big picture is going to look. And I think that's what happens in these kind of cases. But look, Jeff, to me it's remarkable that anybody can actually claim that national security is at stake more than half a century after the events.
Yes.
I think it was shocking that even in 1992 there was still a controversy over, 25 years or so late after the assassination. But here we are 50 years later. Can they stop these records from being released now?
Well, they can. There's a provision under the law, under the JFK Records Act, that allows agencies to request the postponement of the release of the information past the 25-year deadline that we are coming up against in October. So, but in order to do that, the agencies have to appeal to the president. They have to certify that there would be a harm to national security or U.S. foreign policy, and they have to affirm that that harm would be greater than the public interest in disclosure. Now, from a legal standpoint, that's a pretty high bar, and it was designed that way to ensure full disclosure. But if the agencies do that and the president approves, then the material can stay secret. So the decision is taken out of the hands of the agency and put in the hands of the White House, which leads us to President Trump. Obviously, we have a wild card here as a president, very unpredictable, hostile relations with the CIA, at least rhetorically. So would Trump approve of a CIA request to keep withholding some of this material? I don't think anybody knows. The Trump White House did tell Politico last month that they were aware of the issue that was raised by the JFK Records Act and that they were seeking to, stick with the process or some meaningless language like that. So the Trump White House was very non-committal so far about JFK records. And likewise with the CIA. CIA also told Politico last month that they were aware of the process and they were going to do what they could to comply with it. Basically, they committed themselves to nothing. So I expect that the CIA will ask for postponement of at least some of this material. Because I believe, and I think I show in my Newsweek article this week, there's stuff in there that it doesn't have any effect on national security, but it would be highly embarrassing to the CIA. And so they're going to try and keep at least some of this stuff out of public view. So that's what I expect. And I think that we can count on that. What will Trump do? I don't think anybody knows.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, he's obviously engaged in a bureaucratic battle with at least some of these people, and there's obviously a huge movement to remove him from office. But 50 years after the event, for them to keep some of this stuff secret, regardless of their motive, I mean, it's going to look horrible for them as far as I'm concerned.
And they do have a public relations challenge because think about it. A lot of attention has been paid to this issue. This Newsweek article is only the most recent example. Politico has written about this earlier this year. Time magazine highlighted it as one of the anticipated big news stories of 2017. The Economist news magazine did that. So people are paying attention to this release. And if the CIA comes out, when they ask for things to be withheld, they have to ask on a document by document basis. So the CIA would have to say, we want this memo, this cable, this report to be withheld. Well, as soon as they say that, they've identified the thing that they're trying to hide about the JFK assassination. And like you say, that's a public relations nightmare for them. So I don't know what they're going to do. I think we're in for a modified limited hangout probably, which is they give some stuff and hold some other stuff back.
Well, let's assume, just hypothetically speaking, that the theme that Oliver Stone posited in his movie JFK is correct. I mean, let's just say hypothetically that this was a highly sophisticated CIA regime change operation. Then clearly there would be this mosaic of little strands and circumstantial evidence that would support that thesis. And so it would be in their interest to try to delay the most incriminating pieces, the strands, as long as possible. And so for those people who believe that Oliver Stone was right, there's going to be no doubt that the reason that they're trying to get a postponement is to continue the cover-up of this regime change operation that they've been carrying on for over 50 years. Like you say, it's a public relations nightmare for these people.
Yeah. So, how they're going to play it. And then also, I think that if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, the CIA would have had a friend in the White House, and probably the status quo would have been ratified. And whatever the CIA wanted, probably President Clinton would have given them. What President Trump will do, I'm not convinced that he's really that much of an enemy of the CIA. I think it's more of a rhetorical spat. He's not trying to cut their budget. He's not trying to restrict their operations. I think it's a kind of dominance thing. You're not going to dominate me, so I'm going to dominate you. The kind of dynamic that Trump often invokes with his rivals and his adversaries. I think it's possible that Trump will make a deal with the CIA and agree to postpone some things. I also think it's possible that he'll wake up in the morning and say, everything should be made public. Trump's an impulsive guy. He does have populist instincts on this issue. He is a conspiracy theorist. So he might see it in his political interest. And I think it would be in his political interest, because I think it would be very popular to say, let's put all this stuff out there without exception.
Yeah, well, I agree with you about Hillary Clinton. I think if Clinton had been elected president, the entire batch of materials would have been kept secret for another 10, 15, 20, 25 years. But here Trump's the guy with the art of the deal. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Trump says, look, you call off the dogs on the Russia investigation and I'll give you whatever you want on this extension.
Quite possible.
All right, let's move to the other subject. The way I discovered you first many, many years ago was I came across this fight that you were conducting against the CIA in the courts, in the federal courts, regarding a CIA official named George Joannides. And I was so impressed by your tenacity and your perseverance and by what you had uncovered about Joannides in the larger context of the JFK assassination that I started writing a series of articles about it, praising what you had done and analyzing it and let people know. Yeah. And that was how you and I became friends. Would you tell us a little bit about who George Joannides was and how he figures into the overall mosaic here, and why you became particularly interested in this subject?
Well, so when I got interested in the JFK story after 1992, after Congress passed this law. I'd read some books before that, and I was interested in that. But to me, it seemed very far away. It seemed very historical, very old, a lot of theories. The books weren't very good. Didn't seem like it attracted a high level of journalistic interest. A lot of the books were very amateur. So I wasn't too excited. But when Congress passed this law and said, all JFK records, all government JFK records have to be made public, and the law was enforced. And so CIA and FBI started turning over, records that had been kept secret for 30 years. All of a sudden, there was this new body of information. So I thought at that point, I'm not going to solve the Kennedy assassination. I had no illusions about that, but I thought there's going to be some cool stories in this material, because the whole time was so rich with intrigue, with the Castro assassination plots, with all the things that the CIA was doing at the time Kennedy was killed. So when I went through I started going through these papers, and I focused on Cuban exiles in Miami, because I knew a lot about the CIA in Central America and in Cuba. And I ran across a whole batch of documents where there was a CIA officer identified as Howard. And that was, the CIA in its documents never refers to its employees by their real names. They have a cryptonym. So it was a man named Howard, and he was running a Cuban student group, an anti-Castro group in Miami that was quite prominent at the time. They were well-known opponents of Castro. They were quoted in newspaper articles. They had supporters inside Cuba. They were very outspoken against Castro. And so Howard was clearly somebody who was interesting, and he was especially interesting to me because members of his group had contact with Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin, in New Orleans 3 months before the assassination. And if you know the story, Oswald's story, this was the time when Oswald was most publicly identified as a Castro supporter, was in his conflicts with anti-Castro exiles in New Orleans. The Cuban Student Directorate was the name of the group. So I could tell from the documents that I found, this was in 1997, that this CIA officer named Howard had a major role in the group. And the group got a lot of money. They were getting like $50,000 a month in 1963. Okay, if you want to convert that into dollars today, multiply it by 6 or 7. So you're talking about a group of students who are young people, 20 to 25 mostly, getting what are we talking about? $150,000 a month from the CIA in cash. I mean, that was a lot of money. The CIA really relied on these people. So who was Howard? That was a very interesting question. So I went to the CIA and asked them, and they didn't respond. And so I went to the JFK Review Board, which was this independent civilian review panel that was in charge of declassifying records. And I said, please put the question to the CIA. Who was this guy Howard? They put the question to the CIA, and CIA came back and said, we can't identify him. We don't know who that was. Now, I tell you right there, when I saw that answer, I knew that they were lying, because the CIA doesn't lose track of its employees, right? I mean, that was silly. So then the JFK Review Board went out of existence, and I thought, we're just never going to get the answer to the question. But before the JFK Review Board went out of existence, one of their researchers went to the CIA, went through their files, and came back and said, oh no, we figured out who the officer who was running the Cuban students was. His name was George Joannides. Well, by then, the JFK Review Board had gone out of existence. There was no way to investigate. So what I did was I did a lot of research. I went and interviewed a lot of people, found people who knew him. And who was this guy, Howard? His name was Joannides. And what did he do? And I went to Miami, and these Cuban guys knew him. Oh, yeah, I remember him. He was a very well-dressed guy, had a big pinky ring, a New York accent, tough. You know, he was hard on us. He was a tight manager, tight with a buck. Didn't want us to do freelance, anti-Castro stuff. I got a very, strong picture of him. And so one of the things that I learned in doing that was that not only was he funding Cuban students who had contact with Oswald in 1963, but he reappeared in the JFK story 15 years later. And so that was really striking to me. And here's how he reappeared. He was called out of retirement by the CIA to serve as the liaison to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which had reopened the investigation. In fact, he was the chief liaison, which meant basically in Washington terms, if the congressional investigators had a question about a document or we want to talk to this retired CIA officer, Joannides was the guy who would set it up. He was the facilitator. So I thought that was remarkable. Here he is running Cuban students in 1963 who have contact with Oswald and who after the assassination, say Oswald's working for Cuba. They developed the first conspiracy theory ever published. Castro and Oswald were the presumed assassins, they said. And so not only had he done that in 1963, but in 1978, he was called out of retirement. He dealt with the House Select Committee, and he told them nothing about what he was doing in 1963. And so I went to Bob Blakey, the head of the HSC investigation, and I said, Bob, do you remember this guy, Joannides? He was the liaison to your committee. Do you recall him? And he said, oh, yeah. We had a lot of meetings. He was kind of the go-between between us and the agency. And I said, did you know what he was doing in 1963? And Blakey said, no, but we had an agreement with the agency that we didn't want any operational people from 1963, so that we would have a clean investigation. I said, well, I know that was the agreement, Bob, but that's not what happened. Let me tell you who this guy Joannides was. And so I laid it out for Blakey. And Blakey he was many things. He was dumbfounded. He was furious. And he changed his mind about the CIA on the spot. Back in 1978, Blakey had affirmed that the CIA had cooperated with his investigation. When he got this story in 2003, he realized he'd been tricked. They had stuck a guy who was all over Oswald in 1963 as their liaison, and he had told them nothing about it. And I even found records where the investigators came to Joannides and they said, we're really trying to find this guy Howard who was running the DRE. Do you know who he was? He was Howard. And Joannides said, well, I'll look into that for you. And of course, they never got the answer. The CIA fooled Congress, and they obstructed Congress, and Blakey said, this is a felony. What he did to us was a felony. He obstructed a congressional investigation. So I went into court. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for more on him. Didn't get anything. And so I filed a lawsuit and in 2003. And over the years, I actually got a lot of material about George Joannides. out of the sweaty, clenched fists of the CIA, who were furious with me. I mean, talk about people who were unhappy with me. I had a meeting with them at one point to try and negotiate a settlement. I mean, this one woman came in and she didn't even want to shake my hand. She thought I was such a low species. And they were completely intractable. And thanks to the courts, they actually managed to withhold what would have been very interesting material. But so we never got quite to the bottom of the story of what he was doing. I mean, we identified 50 documents related to Joannides' tenure with these Cuban students, related to the assassination investigation, related to the HSCA. And we only got, a few of them. But what we got was very interesting. And it pointed to the fact that this guy was right at the heart of the story. And I want to emphasize that there's no conspiracy theory here. What's interesting about Joannides is he's a mid-level guy. He's not a rogue operator. He's not a conspirator. He's a guy who did the bidding of his bosses and did it well. And so when you see a guy like this buried in the middle of the story and controlling the story, controlling the narrative of the JFK assassination for the House Select Committee, you know that something serious was going on. And what I found, a couple of very interesting documents. One was that Joannides lived in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. He had a residence there. The CIA admitted that in a court filing. So at the time Oswald was in New Orleans, Joannides was in New Orleans too. Now, we don't know. That might be coincidence. But we never knew that before. And that's something that CIA did not want to, never told the Warren Commission, never told the House Select Committee, didn't tell the JFK Review Board, didn't want to tell me. It was only under a court order that they had to give that up. So a very significant piece of the story is, what did the CIA know about Oswald in the summer of 1963? And George Joannides is at the heart of that story. We don't have the answers, but we now know that's a real, live, unanswered JFK question.
Yeah, I find that the whole matter intriguing for several reasons, one of which is that, it was established policy of the Pentagon and the CIA when they were training assassins at the School of the Americas, which Latin Americans call School of Assassins. They were teaching them that whenever you have covert assassinations committed by the government, a way to keep people from learning that the government has done it is to blame it on a communist. And the idea was that, hey, by blaming it on a communist, it would dissuade people from questioning the official version for fear of being smeared as a communist sympathizer, which was like anathema back during the Cold War. And so here you have, ironically, the DRE, this group you're talking about, immediately after the assassination. I mean, within a few hours, they were, I think, the first ones to come out with this press release advertising that Oswald was a communist, and based on these episodes that he had the previous summer. And
absolutely.
So then what you uncovered was the CIA was funding this group that was putting out this press release and keeping it secret.
So if you go back and you look at the first day coverage of the assassination, second day coverage of the assassination, obviously huge news story, and this story, the president was killed by a pro-Castro communist. I mean, the DRE was instrumental in creating the evidence for that belief, which shaped news coverage for weeks after the assassination. A Castroite communist killed the president. And the Warren Commission didn't know that group was funded by the CIA. The HSCA didn't know that group was funded by the CIA. And then you talk about the Operation Northwoods, scenario or concept, right? Create an incident, a contrived situation, as the Pentagon called it. An engineered provocation was another phrase they used. And blame a spectacular crime on the communists. Well, Kennedy gets killed, and here's some CIA assets come forward, and they blame a spectacular crime on the communists. Now, I'm not saying that they're the exact same thing, but you got to ask yourself, what's the explanation of this? And what I tried to do was sue the CIA, and what's the story? What was this guy doing in 1963? And the CIA's response is, drop dead. We will never tell you. And so I know that we're on to something very sensitive here. I don't know what it is, but George Joannides is at the heart of the JFK story. That's for sure.
Well, right. And the fact that they keep it secret just looks horrible because there's absolutely no reason to keep something like that secret. Say, hey, Joannides was an agent, that we want to let you know that we were part of this funding of this group, but to intentionally keep it secret, I mean, as you point out, Blakey said he would never trust the CIA again and on anything relating to the JFK assassination. And now if we go to Judge Tunheim, he was the chairman of the Assassination Records Review Board that was brought into existence by the JFK Records Act. When he learned about Joannides, he's a federal judge. And from my understanding, he himself was outraged that this had not been brought to the attention of the Assassination Records Review Board.
Well, so what happened was the review board asked for this identification, and so they released a handful of documents on Joannides, five or six documents. But Tunheim said, if we had known who this guy was at the time we were in the business, we would have gone back to the CIA and we would have asked for, to look at all of his files, and we would have declassified a whole bunch of it just because that was our approach. Err on the side of disclosure. And so, but the JFK Review Board went out of existence and they never had a chance to do that. So Judge Tunheim said, the stuff that I was pursuing in my lawsuit, he was saying if we had been in existence, we would have made all of that public. And he has reiterated that, that point since. Yes, this was stuff that was obviously relevant to the assassination. It was obviously hidden for a reason, and it should be made public. We don't have access to much of it yet, but the whole circumstances tell us that there was something going on here that was related to the assassination.
Now, if we circle back to the first topic we were talking about, the release of these documents in October, as I understand what you've written, that the Joannides records were not included in these documents that are in the National Archives that are scheduled to be released in October, are they?
No, the CIA's position is that these are not assassination-related records, which is not true, given that Joannides generated them and given what his agents were doing. Everything that he did in 1963 is assassination-related in the eyes of the law. But the CIA is stonewalling, and they're not going to, they're saying this is not subject to release. So without some change, the Joannides material will not be released in October. And that's a weakness of the situation that we have now, is if we do discover new JFK records, we are dependent on the FBI or the CIA to agree that it's a JFK record. Well, they have no incentive to do that because this material would be so embarrassing to them. So they're saying it's not related to the assassination.
Yeah, and how can it not be related to the assassination when this is the group that was advertising Lee Harvey Oswald's communist bona fides? I mean, anything...
Both before and after the assassination, right? They called attention to him as a communist in the summer of '63, and then after Kennedy was dead, they said, "Oh, he and Castro killed Kennedy." So yeah, they're deeply implicated in the story, and the CIA's position is really, it's absurd, but it's difficult to challenge legally.
Well, and Tunheim himself recently said that he favors the release of all these documents in October that are in the National Archives, right?
Yes, he said in a speech in Washington in March, Tunheim said, just release it all. It's not that important. This is very old material. It was certainly our intention that everything should be made public by this time. So, the government should do that. And we're hoping that President Trump and the people around him will see the light and say, yeah, all this stuff should be made public. There's no reason to keep concealing it. If they do keep concealing it, they're just going to be encouraging suspicion and conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and here's a federal judge that is saying this. I mean, it's hard to get more mainstream than a federal judge that's saying, open up the records and let the American people see them.
Yeah.
I should have pointed out your background. You were a reporter for the Washington Post, which is why you're very good at your investigative skills, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, and remind people of the FFF book, CIA and JFK, which tells a lot of this backstory about CIA officers involved in the events leading up to the assassination. George Joannides, one of them, but among a larger cast, and you see, you can really see from the book CIA and JFK that this story, some guy named Oswald came out of nowhere and shot and killed the president, is a cover story. Oswald was a well-known quantity to CIA officials, and the specter of a communist shooting the president was something people had thought about. And so the whole government kind of played dumb after Kennedy was killed and said, oh, gee, too bad that guy Oswald got through. We just didn't know. We never paid attention to him. Why would we pay attention to him? That was all a lie. That was all a preposterous lie. The CIA had been watching Oswald very closely for 4 years, from 1959 to 1963. And that is a story that I tell in my next book, The Ghost, biography of James Jesus Angleton, top CIA official in this period. And I will tell the story of how the CIA monitored Oswald from November 1959 to November 1963.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of things about Oswald that never made sense to me. I mean, here they went after so many people during the Cold War, the Hollywood 10, the communists in the army, the McCarthy commissions, and here Martin Luther King. And, they destroyed people for being suspected communists. And yet here's this so-called communist sauntering across the stage of history, provoking them, handing out pamphlets to Navy personnel advocating communism, and nobody puts a finger on him. And then the other anomaly, of course, is that a communist would want to join the Marine Corps, which is an organization that is committed to killing communists. So there's things that have never made much sense. Right. Tell us a little bit about, you've written this great book for us. It's one of our bestsellers, CIA and JFK, The Secret Assassination Files. Has fascinating stories, not just about Joannides, but also about a woman named Jane Roman. I mean, great stories in there. Tell us a little bit about your new book, and then we'll wrap it up.
So my new book is really, came out of my interest in the CIA and the JFK story. And James Angleton was the chief of counterintelligence for the CIA, which was one of the top 3 positions in the agency. Very powerful man, very secretive, and it turns out very involved in the Oswald story, involved in the monitoring of Oswald. And I knew from the work of John Newman, who was the first one to wrote a book called Oswald and the CIA, to realize just how extensive those contacts were. And I had started going out and interviewing people who might know anything about this. And I met the woman who you alluded to, Jane Roman. She was kind of a right-hand man, as it were, of James Angleton. She was his liaison officer to all federal agencies. So she was very knowledgeable about the Oswald file and about how Oswald was watched. And so I tell the story of Angleton, who had a remarkable career, even quite apart from the JFK story. But really, one of the real contributions of this book is to understand how Angleton's story and the JFK story intersect. And Angleton was both involved in the surveillance of Oswald and the assassination plots against Castro. And those two things converge on November 22nd, 1963. And it's very dramatic the way it happens. And when you see it in that context, it's also, quite frankly, it's very disturbing, because you see that as soon as Kennedy was dead, the intent of the highest levels of the CIA was to prevent an investigation, not to conduct an investigation, to prevent it. And that's what Angleton did. He was the architect of the JFK cover-up.
All right. And the title of that book is The Ghost?
The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spy Master James Jesus Angleton. Be published by St. Martin's Press in October. It's available on pre-order from Amazon and Barnes & Noble now.
Great. And you wrote another fantastic book that I absolutely loved about Winston Scott, a CIA official in Mexico City. What's the title of that book?
It's called Our Man in Mexico. And like James Angleton, Win Scott was part of the founding generation of the CIA, influential personality early on, and good friends with Angleton. And so in some ways, that's kind of the prequel to the Angleton book. These are stories of the first 25 years of the CIA.
Fantastic stuff. Jeff, thanks so much for coming on. Greatly enjoyed the visit with you as always.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.